Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing on the front porch of a small wooden farmhouse in the Oklahoma Panhandle. It is April 14th, 1935. The year is significant. The Great Depression has been grinding the American spirit into the dirt for 6 long years. Poverty is not just a condition here, it is the atmosphere. But on this particular morning, something feels different. It is Palm Sunday. For the first time in months, the sky isn't a hazy yellow or a dull gray. It is a piercing, brilliant blue. The air is unseasonably warm, touching 80 degrees. It feels like a gift. After years of relentless drought, where the very act of breathing felt heavy, this morning feels like forgiveness. Families across the high plains, from the Texas Panhandle up through western Kansas, wake up with a rare sense of optimism. They put on their Sunday best, men in worn-out suits, women in dresses that have been patched a dozen times. They walk to church. The pews are packed. The sermons that morning are about hope, about the resurrection, fitting for the season. After the service, the mood is almost festive. You can hear the sound of children playing in the yards, their laughter carrying far in the dry air. Neighbors visit neighbors. Some families decide to drive their Model T Fords out to the Cimarron River to picnic. Others hang their laundry on the lines, trusting that the white sheets will finally dry without being stained by the omnipresent dust. There is a cruel irony in this piece. The people of the plains are tough. They are survivors of blizzards, tornadoes, and economic collapse. But they have let their guard down. They are enjoying the sun, completely unaware that they are trapped in a geographic bowl, and the lid is about to be slammed shut. They have no radios warning them of what is happening 200 miles to the north. They have no idea that the barometer is crashing. They are enjoying the last few hours of the world as they know it. To understand why the sky would turn black later that afternoon, we cannot just look at the weather. We have to look at the soil, and more importantly, we have to look at the men who broke it. This disaster was not an accident. It was an execution of the land, planned and carried out over the previous decade. Rewind to the 1920s. World War I was raging in Europe, and the United States government needed wheat to feed the troops. They plastered posters across the Midwest with a patriotic slogan, "Wheat will win the war." The government guaranteed high prices. It was a gold rush, but instead of pickaxes, men used plows. Thousands of speculators flooded into the region. They were called suitcase farmers. Men from the city who knew nothing about ecology, arriving in shiny cars with suitcases full of cash. They looked at the endless sea of native buffalo grass and saw only dollar signs. This buffalo grass was a miracle of evolution. Its roots went 5 feet deep, forming a dense, tangled mat that held the moisture and the soil together through centuries of high winds and droughts. It was the skin of the earth, and in less than 10 years, the suitcase farmers ripped it all away. They brought in new, gasoline-powered tractors and disc plows, tearing up 5.2 million acres of virgin grassland. They turned the soil over, exposing the soft, dark earth to the sun and the wind. They operated under a pseudo-scientific myth widely believed at the time. Rain follows the plow. They arrogantly believed that by farming the land, they could permanently change the climate to suit their needs. For a while, nature cooperated. It rained. The wheat grew. Fortunes were made overnight in towns like Boise City and Guimon. But in 1931, the rain stopped. The drought arrived with a vengeance. The crops withered and died, leaving millions of acres of naked, pulverized soil baking in the sun. The buffalo grass was gone. The glue that held the world together had been destroyed. The land was now loose, dry, and ready to fly. Back on that Sunday afternoon, the clock ticked past 3:00 p.m. The first warning wasn't a siren, it was the birds. Thousands of them suddenly took flight, creating chaotic clouds in the sky, fleeing south as fast as their wings could carry them. Then came the jackrabbits, racing across the fields in a panic. The temperature began to plummet. In some towns, the mercury dropped 30 degrees in less than an hour. The warm spring air vanished, replaced by a biting, dry chill. Then, the horizon changed. People looked north and saw a low, dark band stretching across the earth. At first, it looked like a thunderstorm. But as it rose higher, consuming the sky, the color became clear. It wasn't the gray of rain clouds. It was black. A deep, bruising purple black. Like a bruise on the sky. It was a wall of earth, 10,000 feet high and hundreds of miles wide. It boiled and rolled like a tsunami made of soil, churning with a terrifying internal energy. It was moving at 60 miles per hour. Panic struck instantly. Families out on picnics threw their food into the cars and raced home, stepping on the gas pedals of their Fords and Chevys, trying to outrun a monster that was faster than they were. Those who looked back saw the wall swallowing landmarks, barns, water towers, entire towns disappearing one by one into the void. When the wall hit, it didn't wash over the land, it collided with it. It struck with the violence of a solid object. The wind roared like a freight train, a deafening, constant scream that drowned out screams of terror. Sand and gravel blasted against the sides of houses, stripping the paint off wood and scouring the chrome off automobiles. People caught outside were knocked off their feet, their skin sanded raw by the flying grit. They crawled on their hands and knees, blind and choking, desperately feeling for a fence post or a door handle, knowing that if they didn't find shelter in seconds, they would suffocate. Inside the houses, the terror took on a different, more claustrophobic quality. Mothers stuffed wet rags under the door cracks and pasted strips of tape over the window frames, but the dust was an ultra-fine powder, finer than flour. It found every microscopic gap. It poured in through the keyholes, through the floorboards, creating little drifts of dirt on the kitchen linoleum. But the most terrifying aspect of the black blizzard wasn't the wind, it was the darkness. By 4 p.m. the sun was completely blotted out. It wasn't just nighttime dark, it was a total, absolute absence of light. Survivors described it as being trapped in a coal mine. You could hold your hand 3 inches from your face and not see it. People sat in their living rooms, clutching each other, unable to see the person sitting next to them. And then, the laws of physics seemed to break down. The friction of billions of dust particles colliding at high speeds generated massive amounts of static electricity. The air inside the homes became electrically charged. Strange blue flames leaped from barbed wire fences outside. Inside, if you touched a metal stove or a doorknob, a spark would arc and knock you to the ground. Cars stalled instantly as their ignition systems shorted out. Radios hummed with deafening static before dying completely. Women trying to cook a meal found that the static caused the food to crackle and pop. The air grew thick and heavy. The ceiling light bulbs, struggling against the dust hanging in the room, glowed like faint, dying cigarettes. Families tied wet handkerchiefs over their faces, breathing through the damp cloth. They huddled in the corners of their rooms, listening to the wind scream, waiting for the roof to tear off, convinced that this was not a weather event, but the literal end of the world. As the hours dragged on in total darkness, a psychological breaking point was reached. For the deeply religious communities of the Bible Belt, this could only mean one thing: Judgment Day. The description of the storm matched the prophecies of the apocalypse, the sun turning black, the moon turning to blood, the earth rebelling against man. In the suffocating dark, grown men fell to their knees and wept, begging for forgiveness. Families recited the Lord's Prayer over and over, their voices muffled by the masks on their faces. There are recorded accounts of people who were so certain the world was ending that they didn't even try to seek better shelter. They simply sat down in the open fields to wait for the final trumpet. Outside, the animal kingdom was suffering a silent massacre. The storm was an ecological executioner. Flocks of birds, disoriented and blinded by the dust, slammed into buildings or simply fell from the sky, their small lungs clogged instantly. Jackrabbits and prairie dogs were found dead by the thousands the next day, their stomachs filled with sand. Horses and cattle turned their tails to the wind. But it offered no protection. The dust coated their eyes, blinding them, and filled their nostrils until they suffocated standing up. It was a total collapse of the natural order. When the wind finally began to die down late that night, the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy with death. When the sun finally rose on Monday morning, it revealed a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Drifts of gray dust were piled 6 feet high against barns and fences. Cars were buried up to their rooftops. But the nightmare didn't end when the wind stopped. The dust had found a new place to hide. Inside the human body. In the days following Black Sunday, hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors coined a terrifying new term for the condition, dust pneumonia, or locally, the brown plague. It wasn't a virus, it was a mechanical suffocation. The victims were mostly the innocent, infants and the elderly. Their lungs, unable to filter the massive intake of silica and dirt, became coated in mud. The symptoms were agonizing. Children would cough violently, bringing up thick brown sludge. They developed high fevers and chest pains as their bodies tried, and failed, to expel the earth. The Red Cross declared a state of emergency. They set up makeshift hospitals in school gymnasiums and church basements. Nurses worked around the clock, placing wet cloths over the faces of patients, trying to filter the air. But for hundreds, help came too late. The official death toll is hard to calculate, but records show a spike in respiratory deaths that spring. Many mothers had to endure the heartbreak of watching their children slowly suffocate on the very land that was supposed to support them. The livestock that survived the initial storm faced a grim fate. Their teeth were worn down to the gums from grazing on sand-covered grass. Their intestines were impacted with dirt. The government launched a grim relief program, paying farmers a few dollars a head to shoot their own starving cattle and bury them in mass graves. The sound of gunshots echoing across the gray plains became the soundtrack of that spring. While the people of the plains were burying their dead, the politicians in Washington, D.C. were still debating. For years, Eastern politicians had dismissed the stories coming out of the Midwest as exaggerations. They couldn't understand how a little wind could destroy an entire region. They stalled on sending aid, arguing about budgets while the heartland suffocated. But nature has a way of making itself heard. In a twist of fate that seems almost scripted, the dust from Black Sunday didn't stop in Oklahoma. It was carried by the high-altitude jet stream, traveling thousands of miles east. 2 days after the storm, Hugh Bennett, a soil scientist who had been begging Congress for funds to save the soil, was testifying before a Senate committee in Washington. He knew the dust was coming. He dragged out his speech, watching the clock. Suddenly, the room began to darken. The senators looked out the windows of the Capitol building. The Great Plains had arrived in the capital. The sun over Washington, D.C. was blotted out by the soil of Kansas and Oklahoma. The dust settled on the president's desk in the Oval Office. The argument was over. The Soil Conservation Act was passed almost immediately. It was the first time in history a nation mobilized to save its own soil. But for many, the help came too late. The Black Sunday storm broke the spirit of the high plains. It was the final straw. In the months that followed, the largest migration in American history began. They were called Okies, though they came from many states. Families packed their entire lives onto rickety Model T trucks, mattresses, Pots, pans, and children piled high, and hit Route 66. They headed west to California, chasing flyers that promised fruit-picking jobs. They left behind their homes, their history, and their buried dreams. But instead of a promised land, they found bum blockades, police officers stationed at the California border to turn back the poor. Those who got in faced discrimination, living in squalid roadside camps, despised by the locals. The people who had once owned their own land were now refugees in their own country. Looking back, the storm of April 14, 1935, stands as more than just a weather event. It is a monument to human hubris. It taught a young, ambitious nation a brutal lesson. The earth is not an infinite resource to be exploited without consequence. We stripped the land of its natural defenses, the ancient buffalo grass that held the world together, and in return, the land rose up to destroy us. It was a man-made apocalypse, fueled by greed and ignorance and delivered by the wind. Today, the grasslands have mostly recovered. The wheat grows again, and the towns have been rebuilt. But if you visit the high plains on a quiet day, and you look at the old, abandoned farmhouses that still dot the horizon, you can feel the ghosts of that era. You can see the scars on the land. Black Sunday serves as a permanent warning. It reminds us that our civilization exists only by the consent of nature. And when we break the laws of ecology, nature does not negotiate. It strikes back with a fury that no technology can withstand. The black clouds have cleared, but the memory of the day the sun went out remains forever etched in the American soul. Now, I turn the question to you. Had you ever heard the full story of Black Sunday before watching this video? If you had lived in the high plains in the 1930s, faced with a dying farm and a starving family, what would you have done? Would you have packed up your life and risked everything on the road to California, or would you have stayed to fight for your land? And most importantly, if you have parents or grandparents who lived through the Great Depression or the Dust Bowl era, please share their stories in the comments below. We want to keep these memories alive. If you found this documentary valuable, please like this video and consider subscribing to the channel for more uncovered history. Share this story with someone who needs to see it. Thank you for watching.